So here I am with my friend Hazel, who you might recognize if you've been watching my channel for long enough, but literally a year ago, she was also in one of my COSI videos, so...
I was just a master's student then.
Maybe it'll become a thing. But I'm really excited to formally, properly introduce Hazel. She's one of my super good friends, also in history. We had the same job, that's how we met. And so, yeah, she's got an honors in history for her undergrad, a master's in Canadian military history, and is currently, well, about to start her PhD in Canadian military history and looking at sort of relationships with the Australian and New Zealand Army. Mm-hmm. So today, we're talking about something that we've discussed a lot in our private life through various, connections with living history and our own personal interests, and that is this idea of gender expression and performing gender in the First World War, which is really interesting, and especially the way that even now reenactors really tend to glorify this idea of men in the wars, any of them really.
Yeah.
So
yeah, the world wars are a whole separate ballgame when it comes to that. I don't know if it's because they're comparatively more recent. There's just in general because they occurred in the 20th century. There was a lot more record keeping and records that have survived. I don't know.
We'll get into it. But before that, 2 super quick notes just about the way we're talking about stuff. So first of all, in terms of gender, we're talking about it very much in a binary sense. Even back then, and some of the stuff we're touching on is still very fluid in terms of the way gender was expressed. Just the terminology that we have historically in a lot of these sources really only refer to things in a strictly binary sense. And secondly, this isn't going to be a video about gender roles. There's a lot talking about that and the way that these roles change throughout the wars, but this is more about gender expression and the ways that sort of developed and changed a lot in this war. And hopefully, we're going to try to break down some of these romanticizations and misconceptions about that. Take it away.
All right. Well, I think before we really get into the First World War itself, we need to understand the sort of interrelation between war and masculinity, specifically in a Victorian context, because again, we're talking about Canada, which is very, very closely linked with Britain throughout this whole period, because as Canada, formerly a British Dominion, along with Australia and New Zealand, we inherited a lot of our understanding, and again, I'm speaking about English Canada, like white English settler Canada, we inherited a lot of our understanding about, what a man is, or what a woman's place is from Britain. So part of that involved understanding war as kind of really the pinnacle of kind of masculine behavior, where it's essentially a proving ground where, someone who is male goes to embody all that is man.
Right.
Essentially, it just speaks to the overall romanticization of what war looks like in a time where war and pageantry were very closely connected.
And even on that too, war having this strong association with masculinity isn't even truthful, because women have always participated in wars since wars have began as, active militant roles, in some cases as more passive but support roles as well, which usually tends to be the case.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting as well, because we have tons of records of women who participated as soldiers, as cooks, as laundresses, just following the army and selling various goods. So even then, we have this idea, like you said, of this Victorian masculinity really coming through, yet at the same time, there's this undercurrent of feminine influence and women actively participating in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, with Canada specifically, it also bears mentioning that, Canada, again, English, white, settler Canada, stemmed from Britain and was very much, a product of the British Empire. So in addition to these sort of very Victorian notions of what, war and masculinity should look like when they intersect, you also have this idea of frontier. How we can have frontiers when there are already people there, I do not know. But yes, you have this intersection between this frontier mentality, this romanticization of frontier life, and these notions of masculinity. So this is something that it's not unique to Canada. You saw it a lot in Australia as well. The thinking was, and again, this is a very constructed way of looking at it, both leading up to the war, during the war, and especially since the war, in historical writing, it's sort of this very constructed image of like, the frontiersman come soldier. I actually have a quote here I'll read to you. This is Arthur Currie, by the way. He commanded the Canadian Corps from 1917 to the end of the war, and he wrote this in an introduction to an unofficial history called Canada's Sons in Great Britain in the World War.
He's a bit of a legend in Canadian
history. He very much
kind
is.
Kind of a mythological figure.
And this is what he had to say about the Canadian soldier with respect to Canada and the natural environment. So he writes that the rugged strength of the Canadian is depicted in his broad shoulders, his deep chest, and strong, clean-cut limbs. His eyes are keen and steady, while behind the calm gravity of his mien lies a tenacious and indomitable will. These are the invaluable gifts of our deep forests and lofty mountains, of our rolling plains and our great waterways, and of the clear light of our northern skies, gifts which have enabled the Canadian to adapt himself readily and well to new conditions he found confronting him as a soldier. So it's a very deliberate linking of, this idea of roughing it in the bush and becoming a soldier, and how that, somehow men from the Dominions are more men than, men from Britain, which was, they were often sort of perceived and described as like runtish or unhealthy. And I do want to briefly mention another quote by another very sort of notable figure from this time, C.E.W. Bean, who was Australia's official historian of the Great War. He was the official correspondent during the Gallipoli campaign, so like very, very well known. And what he had to say is essentially that men who come from Britain to Australia or Canada, I believe he listed both of those, would within, this is a direct quote by the way, would within 2 or 3 generations breed men again.
Jeez.
So again, very, very close ties between the idea of like the frontier and being a man, being a sort of strong, healthy, virile man.
I think even this idea of the Canadian wilderness being the defining feature of Canada, it still persists today. And,
absolutely.
And the imagery of lumberjacks and log drives and
flannel, anyone?
Yes, exactly. It all forms this national identity myth, and so much of it is directly linked with masculinity. Even though you mentioned Roughing It in the Bush, of course, is a very famous early Canadian piece of literature by Susanna Moodie, who was a settler writer from England, and she detailed her life here and her experiences here. It's one of the most well-known sources on early settler life. So even then, you have, once again, women still actively participating and existing within the same parameters as the ideal manly Canadian man, and also still having these chaste, virtuous, religious gender expectations, and parameters to exist in. So it's also kind of, you have like 2 streams of thinking happening at the same time.
And they're oftentimes kind of contradictory, and it's just like...
Oh, contradictions! We'll get into that.
Oh, yes we will! So I guess now we come to the war. I'm not going to rehash the entire history of the First World War, because that...
You've just done 2 years of a master's and about to embark on 5 years of a PhD.
It's like, I need 1 minute to not think about
the
complex chain of events.
History.
See a timeline in my head. But as we all know, the war broke out in summer of 1914, and basically, for the first few months of the war, it was fairly mobile. But very quickly in the autumn of 1914, we come to the digging in on the Western Front. And now when we think of the First World War, I guarantee the first thing that anyone in Canada or the US or...
Say it with us. Trenches!
There was a lot more to it than the trenches, but for the interest of just simplicity and being concise, I will be focusing on the infantry specifically as it pertains to the trenches. But basically what you had is you had a long-standing sort of static position on the Western Front. I mean, in the trenches and outside the trenches, we saw this sort of flourishing of a soldier's culture, from like newspapers to, you know, to songs, to stories, to entirely like new dialects of slang, some of which were like specific to different nations. But also we saw something very interesting, and that was the sort of the emergence of like concert performances. And as part of that, we also saw, I guess, what you could today call, by like today's standards, would be considered drag queens, which is a fascinating chapter in First World War history, and it has gotten some attention. It's usually quite, you know, it's not a footnote to history, but it's usually dealt with quite briefly. But basically, what sort of these concerts would entail is that there would usually be a segment where a man, because yes, it was largely a very homosocial enterprise, so it was just men surrounded by men all the time. And so you have men fulfilling the roles of women in these stage productions. And oftentimes, you know, you'd have a man come out in full drag, and I'm talking like full drag, and, you know, they'd often sort of put on kind of a very cabaret performance, or they'd sing very sentimental songs. And it wasn't that, you know, this was sort of something that was just to be laughed at. I mean, there was an element of humor to it, but it wasn't strictly in terms of humor that they were popular, but because they were hugely popular. And, you know, you saw behind the lines, you saw like the development of like specific, well-known kind of theater troupes that would like travel around to different parts of the front line. So the Dumbbells was one that was very, very famous as a Canadian sort of soldiers theater troupe. Dress up, if they could scrounge up some women's clothes or some makeup or some wigs. Usually, like there were instances of them using the heads of mops as wigs.
I love that.
That's a true fact.
I love that.
It's a history fun fact for you. Yeah, they were immensely popular, and a great deal of effort was put into these performances. I know there's been a lot of sort of discourse, especially more in recent years, about why were these performances so popular. Tim Cook, who's a very, very well-known, very famous Canadian First World War historian, has argued that the popularity of such performers likely sort of had two main kind of branches. One, it sort of spoke to the loneliness that these men felt. I mean, they were thousands of miles from home, and everything that they'd known. And, you know, while it was possible for British soldiers on leave to go back home to the UK, for those whose families were in Canada, that was obviously not feasible. So it is profoundly isolating to be so far away from, you know, family, parents, siblings, sweethearts. The majority of Canadians serving overseas during the First World War were unmarried, but there were married men. And also it was younger men too, who were sort of often the most successful as performers. The terminology that's used in sort of primary sources from the period, wouldn't use it today. They tend to, you know, they might say like the woman with quotation marks around woman, or they might say female impersonator. So
right, yeah.
If I use that language at any point, please know I'm quoting these specific sources.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's a bit dodgy, obviously, as any research into times past. The other sort of pillar that Cook suggests was that, you know, this sort of drag performance, as we would consider it now, could also very much have been a means of exerting agency and sort of pushing back against this traditional notion of, like, you know, what soldiering was supposed to be, and, you know, the very sort of hierarchical structure of, like, military authority, and, you know, possibly even just against the masculine ideals that soldiering itself represented on, like, a very broad and conceptual level. But yeah, you mentioned Ross Hamilton. He's probably one of the best examples to look at if you're interested in reading more about like drag performers during the First World War. So he toured with the soldiers' troupe, the Dumbbells, which I mentioned earlier, and the stage name he had was Marjorie. So Marjorie was very popular, so popular in fact that he toured as Marjorie after the war as a drag performer, like across Canada for years.
One of the other things, in comparison to these soldiering men are also the nursing sisters, who, so you mentioned this idea of performing and adopting these female personas as potentially being a pushback. Yeah. And to counter that, a lot of what the nursing sisters did was leaning into femininity, because immediately society had these conceptions about, okay, listen, we have these unmarried, most of them were unmarried, older, like in their 30s up until their 60s, women who were trained nurses in medical school, who were now going over and participating actively. So the nursing sisters were different from volunteer nurses. They had the rank, they had an officer's rank.
Starting as lieutenant.
Yep, starting as lieutenant, and they had pay. And that's something that not many, if any, other military countries had. The British nurses absolutely resented them for that, actually, because they believed that they were less trained. They were colonial women, they were less trained, there was a lot of resentment there. But because of these ideas about femininity and the expression of that, having women in close proximity to men, naked men, various bodily functions, basically being close enough to the front line. We had instances of Canadian field hospitals getting bombed.
Absolutely, yeah.
It was devastating. And of course, being in this very male-dominated environment made people believe that sisters, like the nursing sisters, weren't women anymore, but they weren't treated or respected like men. So you have this situation where these women are in this bizarre, genderless, in a way, middle ground. And so throughout their whole career, they're working as anesthesiologists, they're working as, assisting doctors and physicians and surgeons and doing all this stuff, which is mentally and physically draining and exhausting. And in their spare time, they are going out and they are reaffirming their femininity by buying silk underwear, by buying perfume and makeup and all of these things, perhaps in a way to prove to themselves that they are still women, to prove to their, other doctors and male counterparts that they are still women, that they are deserving of gentle things. And in terms of their other, duties to their families, it was believed to be a dutiful and good daughter. You had to write home all of the time. So, now you've done all this work. You go out to town, maybe if you have leave, you buy some nice things to kind of make you feel like you're not completely lost in the turmoil of war. And now you have to write multiple letters to your family, and a lot of those letters are also completely minimizing their own experiences.
Absolutely.
As not to make their family worry that they're really going on this big adventure and they've loved seeing Europe, when you're seeing these young boys who you might have a sisterly affection for, perhaps even a romantic one, or a maternalistic one, dying all of the time and being in this proximity to violence, which none of them had ever seen before. The medical aspect, yes, they were trained nurses, they were working in hospitals before they went overseas. But
nothing like this.
Exactly, this level of violence was unlike anything, really anybody had seen before.
Yeah, thanks industrialized warfare.
Yeah, so with the men doing these performances, you're leaning away, you're really kind of making a lot of contradictory actions to the expected roles and performances of gender. But for the women, for the nurses, they had to lean into femininity as a way to perhaps preserve it for themselves, but at least convince everybody else that they were still women, even though they were exposed to all of this gore.
Yeah, and perhaps more importantly, the two can coexist at the same time.
So then also on the topic of nursing sisters, we also have this disconnect in a way, which Hazel has some really interesting points to bring up, but I'll just kind of preface it with this idea that you're a nursing sister, you're taking care of these men, and of course, specific military doctrine encouraged heterosexual relationships, as long as they were also an officer, so the nursing sisters couldn't be romantically interested in anybody that was a lower rank than them.
Yeah.
But you really have these situations where these women are operating to a certain extent as a machine. It's not affectionate. They're taking care of men and they're obviously doing their job, but they're not overly being affectionate towards them. And you can see this for two reasons. One, you don't want to give these lonely single men something to think, oh, I might have a chance because, it's war. and which is also a whole other conversation, because the role of the nurse as mother, as lover, as caregiver has also been mythologized completely.
Oh, absolutely.
That's another video.
Yeah.
So you have this care that's happening, but it's not very like, oh, honey, it's gonna be okay. It's very much
utilitarian.
She's doing her job, and that is what her training is. And you know, I've seen sketches, and I can't remember if it's the First or Second World War, but in essence, it's basically the same. Of, you know, soldiers they're in their sick bed and they're like just trying to pass the time, and they've drawn sketches of them about how tightly the nurses have packed them into their beds. They're basically lying in bricks. He's like, oh, there she goes again, like Sister Agnes, just doing it to all the men. None of us can move. So you have this, once again, this leaning away. You still have this traditional expected role of women being caretakers, of nurses. But there's this level of professionalism that is really unheard of before that's happening here. This professional expectation, and you're kind of also saying, well, listen, like, we're not here to play this romantic side character in a movie. We're here to do our job, and our job is to try to save as many of these people as possible.
Yeah.
And that doesn't often mean there's time for unnecessary affection and affectionate demonstrations. But in contrast, you do still see this happening, but in the trenches.
Yeah, it's interesting too is when you talk about sort of, again, back to the masculine, is you kind of see the inverse, where essentially when you talk about nursing sisters, you see them leaning away from kind of this notion of very sort of tender, caring behavior, whereas there are a lot of instances of men in the trenches specifically leaning into that kind of role. You see it especially when you see how officers, especially junior officers, because junior officers like lieutenants and captains, they were responsible for smaller groups of men, which meant that they were far more likely to actually get to know the men or to interact with them more frequently. But there's sort of this expectation of care where the junior officer, the lieutenant, the captain, was expected to kind of fulfill a parental role, especially a maternal role at times. There was one instance, a British example, but again, Canadian and British experience do overlap in many, many ways. One officer, I believe a lieutenant, he recalled going around to all the dugouts where his men were sheltering during just routine shelling, which happened all the time, especially towards sort of the latter half of the war. But he likened it to being a mother going round to each of her children's bedrooms during a thunderstorm, to console, to ensure that, everything was okay, and to reassure. And it wasn't just this level of kind of checking in, of sort of emotional awareness of the well-being of the men, but also just sort of very practical duties. You had junior officers who were responsible for dealing out, minor punishments if there were issues with behavior, not so severe that you wanted to escalate it to, the upper echelons of command. It would be the officers that on a platoon level or on a company level that would sort of dole out these punishments. They're expected to be kind of disciplinarians, but also not to be like too harsh, because at the same time they're working every day with these men. They have to be trusted by these men. They were responsible for ensuring that rations arrived, so men had something to eat, or that water arrived. But it was the responsibility of the officers, the junior officers especially, to make sure that men were as well cared for as possible, that they were as clean as possible, that they were as warm as possible, especially in the winter time. And basically just sort of all these routine tasks. They had like a very, very specific sort of military practical purpose, but at the same time you had these junior officers, many of whom came from sort of the middle class. You had men drawing on their sort of middle class upbringing, where there generally wasn't the same like hired help to raise children. The children were raised by the parents and family members or close friends. So you see men drawing from these experiences of being raised in a household like that and translating them into the military environment. And what's fascinating too is you see especially in like manuals for training officers on how to sort of interact with men and how to sort of be a most effective leader, really struggle with how to kind of square this very maternal behavior with like the image of like the fatherly kind of soldier.
Right.
Yeah, and it was one example. I believe it was a British manual, where basically, you know, these men were instructed, these officers were instructed, you know, not to dry nurse the men under their command, but were expected to be fatherly to them all the same. So they were still trying to couch it in masculine terms, but the reality is, it was often it fell under what would be conceived of as sort of a more motherly example of care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that physical affection was shown amongst the men too also very much changed in this time period. Well, I guess in this event.
Yeah,
really,
because it was quite a transient, I guess, phenomenon. Is you didn't just see sort of this sort of familial interaction between officers and men, but you saw this sort of dynamic, especially between men of like the same rank, that really defies classification, I think, a lot of the time. Sort of despite kind of this idea of like the Victorian romantic friendship between men, it was fairly uncommon to see sort of physical tactile affection. It wasn't common. It was usually sort of reserved for like female friends. It was more acceptable for two women to be physically affectionate with each other at sort of a platonic level. Again, once you take the sort of intensity and the extremity of living through the sort of first large-scale industrialized combat, it evokes more extreme emotions, and in turn that evokes more sort of, not extreme expressions, but sort of, I guess that's the best word I can use, is sort of a more extreme expression that oftentimes translated into sort of very kind of tactile behavior. And it wasn't just, you know, kisses. I'll come back to kisses in a second, but like the entirety of war as a homosocial enterprise necessitated sort of a lot of like close interaction between men. You know, men, they fought and they lived alongside each other for years at a stretch. You know, they cared for each other when they were sick, or they were known to, you know, wrap blankets around each other if they were cold. They would literally sleep. They'd have like a sleeping buddy a lot of the time, or like a little group of men, and they would routinely like sleep together for warmth. And you know, they would sort of stay with the same people if they were moving positions along the front or if they were behind the lines. And there were so many instances of men just like dying in each other's arms. So it's this kind of preoccupation with touch, and touch filling the spaces where words can't express the depth and the extremity of emotions. And so that brings us back to this notion of the kiss, specifically the dying kiss, which is, especially like in post-war sort of fiction and poetry, it often comes up. It defies explanation. It really does, because, you know, it's not strictly understood. It would be reductive to strictly understand, you know, a kiss between men in this context as strictly erotic.
Right.
I mean, like, there are, obviously, you know, if you want to do some quick math and get some statistics, there have been LGBTQ plus members of the armed forces from time immemorial.
Yep.
Though, you know, this is 100 years ago, that kind of reality was not acknowledged at all. Like, there were some well-known gay men, like Siegfried Sassoon, very famous First World War poet, was an avowed homosexual, I believe is how he described himself at one point.
Well, even amongst the nursing sisters as well, there were two women who met each other in the order, and when the war was done, they moved in together back in BC, in British Columbia, and they lived together the rest of their lives. And so there's no historical documentation that specifically states, oh, they were in a relationship together, but you know what I mean? It's like, there are certain things through history like that where it doesn't have the labels and the language we use now, but you look at it and you're like, what else could this be? Like, I guess that kind of just points to what you were mentioning about this kiss wasn't an erotic thing. It wasn't necessarily an expression of sexuality.
Yeah.
But more an expression of this extremely traumatic time. And I also think maybe the barriers and these ideas of masculinity stopped existing in certain instances. So you could kiss your dying friend. And by kiss, it wasn't necessarily on the lips. It was like on the face.
Yeah. Including the lips.
Including the lips, but kind of just more broadly the face.
Yeah, you could lips, forehead, cheek. Like, it was just, it was it was sort of this impulsive, a lot of the time, again, I'm making some generalizations here, but it was a lot of the time this very sort of impulsive, just rush of emotion. Like, it wasn't necessarily a calculated thing. It was, it came deep, deep inside the emotional core.
So it's this phenomenon that kind of transcends explanation, like you said, deeply emotional, but without those strict ideas about masculinity sort of falling away in that moment. You can do this and not be shamed by your peers.
Exactly.
Because back then, obviously, that's something that would happen. Put these people in this situation where so many barriers are just not there anymore. And you have situations like this, these moments.
Yeah, there's a specific, again, this is a frequently sort of cited in historical literature as sort of a really good example of the intensity of emotion that comes up in these circumstances. And this even sort of calls back to that maternal kind of behavior. I mean, even you have two men on equal footing who are, not necessarily behaving towards one another as like, a mother to a child, but again, it's this equivocation of this kind of expression of emotion with the feminine and with the non-erotic feminine too. It's part of what makes it so difficult to define in any concrete sense is, again, the language, and not strictly in terms of language in terms of gender and sexuality, but just the language to rationalize what you were experiencing. I mean, it's something that comes up in a variety of different ways, especially in the letters of men. You read letters of men who wrote home, like they struggle to articulate their experiences. And it's interesting too because there are Canadian soldiers and British soldiers and just in general men who they went home after the war if they were lucky enough to get home in relatively sound body and as sort of mentally okay as possible, who found that they really miss the relationships they had with their friends at the front because again I mean obviously there were gay and bisexual and queer men who served that we just, we don't know because, like, the language didn't exist to the same extent. Also, he was still criminal at the time as well. Yeah, so I'm absolutely don't mean to sort of reduce their experiences. But for the most part, these were heterosexual men. Just by simple statistical majority. Men who sort of deeply longed for these connections that they had for a period of time during the war. But they didn't, there wasn't really a way to explain the intensity of these relationships to people who hadn't experienced them themselves or who weren't there kind of living through that.
Well, and once again, so those barriers of societal masculine expectations are back up once you reach society again.
It's this temporary sort of suspension.
Yeah.
And I think it's temporary suspensions like that we see, with conflicts throughout the 20th century, just all of history in general, where, they kind of, the barriers go away and then they come back. But every time they come back, it's a little weaker. And I mean, I guess that's a sort of the gradual march of time and progress, but their struggle to express how they felt in these instances and how sort of they related to their friends and how sort of what form this relationship looked like. Because it wasn't strictly, it wasn't necessarily at all an erotic thing. I would strongly recommend, if you're interested in further reading, Shantanu Das. He wrote an excellent book called Touch and Intimacy in First World War Literature. It's a very good read.
I can include a list of recommended
reading
in the description of the video as well, because
there's some,
you can see we decorated our table with some books, but there's a lot of really amazing work that's out there. And of course, Hazel is going to be adding to that body of literature soon. Well, already has at this point.
Well, I guess we'll see. Publisher perish.
But back to the letters and the affection.
Yeah, oftentimes what comes through, again, is this sort of maternal care. It's like motherly tenderness. I want to read just a brief quotation from a letter. This is a British soldier who's one of his best friends was killed right in front of him, essentially, in the trenches.
The sentiments expressed here are, I mean, they made me cry the first time I heard it, but I think
it's very
really
powerful.
Does speak to this larger experience as well.
Yeah.
It's just one of those examples that we have written down that's just, it kind of takes your breath away a little bit.
Yeah, you gotta sit in, like, silence after you read it.
Yeah.
It's, but yeah, basically the context of the letter is you have this young man, whose friend, whose name is Jim, was killed in front of him. Either by a bullet or by a shell, it's not really sure. After his friend was killed, this man was writing to his friend's mother, to kind of just give her a bit more information. He wrote, and I quote, "I suddenly saw Jim reel to the left and fall with a choking sob. I did what I could for him, but his stout heart had already almost ceased to beat, and death must have been mercifully instantaneous. I held him in my arms to the end, and when his soul departed, I kissed him twice where I knew you would have kissed him, on the brow, once for his mother and once for myself." I remember the first time I read it, I think I just sort of sat there for like a few minutes. There are lots of examples of that kind of writing. This one just is particularly powerful. I'm not sure why. I don't know if that's just me or just you or in general, but it's the two kisses, I think, for me, if I'm just to turn on my literary brain.
Yeah.
Not to pick apart a 100-year-old letter about a man getting killed, but it's alongside the mother, right? It's a very sort of maternal gesture to sort of hold your dying friend in your arms and kiss his forehead like a mother would kiss, a sick child.
Yeah.
But, he kissed him once for his mother, but also once for himself. And it's a sort of, it's adjacent to so many types of affection, but it's never entirely an example of one type of affection. It is such a complex sort of set of circumstances. That's the grad student brain right there. It's just like, wow, it's complicated.
Yeah. And I think with that, that's kind of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
So, to quickly recap, we've discussed a lot of things in this video.
Mm-hmm.
So we first began by talking about this idea of Victorian masculinity, what that looked like for Canadian men, and sort of these ideas about how a Canadian man would conduct himself as a soldier.
Yeah.
And then we started looking at sort of, well, how was that pushed back? How were those kind of ideas broken down through theater performance, through physical affection, and through these roles of kind of maternal responsibility that the soldiers had, that the officers had for their men under their care.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there were a few notes in comparison with the nursing sisters about how, while men were sort of pushing back on these ideas of masculinity, whether consciously or unconsciously, the nursing sisters were consciously leaning into femininity to continue to prove that with all the horrors they were seeing, yes, they were still women. So I think in terms of one of my closing remarks, I would say gender has always been fluid, and expressions of gender have always been fluid. And you really see it very strongly on a large scale when wars happen. And I think even at the beginning of the video we said, yes, this is very much a discussion in the gender and sexuality binary, I would say. There's still so many overlaps that can't really fit into any category. Which I think is important to note and take away. That would be my key takeaway from this conversation, is that when you look at the past, when you look at soldiers, when you look at these ideas of masculinity and femininity and how they work together, the way that we address this, and specifically in reenacting spheres, never incorporates that. And so, and in film, it never really incorporates that. So our ideas, unless you have a dedicated person, such as yourself, doing all of this research, our memory of these events, they never encompass that level of sensitivity and that allowance of fluidity.
I could honestly go on about sort of narrative tropes that you see in fiction dealing not just with the First World War, any war really. The kind of the trope of the very sort of strong soldier meeting the kind of, I guess, French farmer's daughter kind of. Again, this kind of very romanticized interaction between men and women, and in reality, I mean, like, that kind of thing, it could happen. It did happen. It was not the norm. It was not, a universal experience. There were a lot of men. I mean, they were, again, in these homosocial groups for years. Basically, just in essence, it was our understanding of the past and our articulation of the past. It still it just instinctively harkens back to this very kind of rigid binary understanding and be like, hey, these were the norms. This thing happened and there was transgression, and then, kind of things went back to the way they were, at least, for the most part. And we see that, we reaffirm that so often when we sort of talk about this kind of thing. We talk about, the young, brave Canadian. War as an enterprise is more transgressive, and there's more room for that kind of transgression, I think, and we see that a lot. War and the study of, and this is why the study of military history, I think, is continually so important. Is like, when you study military history, it's not memorizing the types of tanks. That can be helpful. But really it's looking at all the different societal factors and how they intersect and how they, challenge each other and how they reaffirm each other. You see intersections of politics, of economy, of, tactics and strategy. And you see a lot of sort of like gender in flux. It's difficult to tease out, just one thread here and one thread here, because there's this whole knot of conflicting social phenomena, I guess. And obviously, I firmly believe, we as historians will never, be able to fully encapsulate, what it was to be a man at this time, or what it was to be a woman at this time, or like how that was specifically challenged in a way that's applicable to everyone, because that's just not possible. It merits a lot further study and a lot further discussion, because as long as we still keep kind of jerking back to these like, war as manly exercise, women nurse kind of thinking, we're not really going to get anywhere. As not just in terms of looking at the past, but like looking forward to the future.
Yeah. That's a good note to end it on, I think. If any of you have any questions, Hazel and I are always in touch, so if there's something I don't have the answer to, you will get an answer.
Oh yeah, that's literally my job.
Yeah, seriously.
Answer questions.
Yeah. But no, I mean, it was great having you.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
And chatting about something that we've talked a lot about in our personal lives, and
often with sort of great frustration
and many cuss words.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, we're not talking about toy soldiers or G.I. Joe figures. Like you are talking about a massive amount of culturally diverse, racially diverse, yes, gender diverse,
religious
people,
religious
religious diversity too. And you cannot sum it up by falling back on sort of the same archetypes we've used for hundreds of years.
Oh, well, it was just like that back then.
Yeah.
But even saying that is an untrue statement, because it wasn't.
Yeah, that sort of construction of it is not just, like the product of sort of certain societal attitudes at the time. It's also the product of construction over decades, over hundreds of years in some cases, of kind of trying to reaffirm and make meaning out of what often is just a mess. And to sort of look at those kind of experiences as this sacred kind of masculine adventure is, first of all, it's not only a disservice to, I think, women and gender diverse people in the field today, but to the people who lived through it then, because it invalidates their experience of transgression. And it, again, I'm saying transgression against, these very sort of accepted
norms,
social practices at the time of how men and women binaries ought to behave. It completely invalidates the the experiences of men and women who found comfort, who found solace, and in different expressions of gendered identities.
In any case, we're always around to talk about this kind of stuff, and I hope that you came away learning something new, and you can kind of think about that view of things, especially if you're a historian of the First World War or a costumer of the First World War. So with that said, thank you again for
having me.
Taking the time and sharing your knowledge, and I'm sure you'll be back.
This is very fun for me. It's good practice.
Anyway, I guess we'll sign off.
Yeah. What was this weight?
Influence.
Swagman.
Petition to bring Swagman back.
I don't know how it works. Sometimes I'll just... I don't know why people love the cavalry so much. I mean, like, I like horses too. Don't get me wrong.